The dpaa file opens with a sentence that arrives decades too late. Accounted for, Sergeant Chester A. Johnson, Jr., age 20, did not vanish cleanly. He survived the sky, then disappeared inside a city of fire. SS Sergeant Louis T. Vance, the only man to leave Japan alive, carried one line for the rest of his life. Everybody had time to jump. In Houston, Johnson's mother folded letters and waited for a detail she always asked for. Tell me what you ate. I can't pretend to know that kind of waiting. I only know how it settles into objects: a pocket hymn book, a creased photo strip, a telegram envelope kept flat. Dr. Mara Klein studies the timeline and understands the first mistake. The crash was never the real question. On Saipan, mornings began before the sun felt real. The air was already thick, the kind that clung to skin and made shirts useless within minutes. Sergeant Chester A. Johnson, Jr. woke to the same routine every mission day. Boots first. Laces pulled tight. Loosened, then tied again. He always did it twice. As if the second knot could correct something the first one missed. He shaved with cold water from a dented canteen, listening to the distant cough of engines being warmed somewhere beyond the tents. The sound wasn't frightening anymore. It was just there, like surf. Johnson was 20. He had been overseas long enough that the idea of before had started to feel unreal, like a place you once lived but could no longer describe accurately. Still, he kept objects that insisted on remembering for him. Before breakfast, he checked his radio kit, not once, twice. He ran his fingers along the cables, felt for cracks in the insulation, tapped the casing lightly near the dials. Then he reached into the same pocket every time and touched the folded letter. He didn't open it. He just made sure it was there. Across the strip, Captain Will F. Latimer, Jr. was already up. Latimer had a habit that the crew pretended not to notice. Every time he climbed into the cockpit, he tapped the instrument panel with his knuckles, once, twice, like knocking on a doorframe before entering a house. It was quiet, almost private. If anyone ever asked him about it, he would have laughed and changed the subject. That morning, he didn't laugh. He just nodded as the men gathered. Someone had found a can of peaches. It was already warm from the heat, the syrup thin and sticky. There was one spoon. SS Sergeant Louis T. Vance held it up like a prize. "Gentlemen," Vance said, "we dine." They passed the can around, careful not to spill. Johnson took a small bite, slower than the others. He tasted sugar and metal and decided it was good enough to remember. Vance watched him and grinned. "Radio man eats like he's on shore leave." Johnson shrugged. "Invisible job," he said. "Got to enjoy something." Vance laughed. "If we don't crash, nobody remembers you were even here." It was meant as a joke. It landed like one. None of them knew how carefully that sentence would be carried later. The night before, Johnson had written to his mother. He sat on his bunk with the paper braced against his knee, sweat spotting the edges. He kept his handwriting neat. She liked it that way. "If you don't hear from me for a while," he wrote, "it just means I'm busy doing my job." He didn't mention fear. He didn't mention the hours. He didn't mention the way the engines sounded when they were pushed too hard. He ended the letter the same way he always did, with a promise he believed was small enough to keep. Back in Houston, his mother kept a ration tin on the kitchen counter. It had once held coffee. Now it held envelopes emptied, flattened, smoothed with her palm before being placed inside. Telegram envelopes went there too. She didn't throw any of them away. She told herself she was being practical, but it was something else. It was a routine that made waiting feel like work. When she read Johnson's letters, there was one detail she always looked for, and when it wasn't there, she felt unsettled. "Tell me what you ate." Food meant time had passed. Food meant the body was still being cared for. Food meant tomorrow was assumed. Johnson knew this. Sometimes he made things up. Sometimes he didn't. That morning on Saipan, he tucked the folded letter into his pocket and added the other items he always carried. The hymn book was small, cheap, the cover worn soft at the corners. Inside the front page, his initials were written carefully. C.A.J. He didn't read it often, but he liked knowing it was there. The photo booth strip was thinner now from being unfolded and refolded. Him and a girl from back home. Both of them leaning in too close, smiling like the future was a simple thing. As they walked toward the aircraft, The heat rose off the coral runway in visible waves. Someone complained about the smell of fuel. Someone else complained about nothing at all, just to hear his own voice. Latimer gathered them briefly near the ladder. He didn't give a speech. He never did. "We'll be back for breakfast," he said. It was a small lie, a comforting one. Johnson nodded anyway. Inside the aircraft, the noise swallowed everything. Johnson took his position at the radio station, adjusted the headset until the pressure felt right against his ears. The vibrations came up through the floor and into his legs. He checked the dials. He checked them again. For a few moments, before takeoff, there was a strange stillness. Engines idling. Men waiting for the signal. Johnson thought about the peaches and decided he would mention them in his next letter. The flight itself blurred into routine. Hours stretched and folded back on themselves. Johnson listened. He transmitted. He waited. Sometimes he counted silently, a habit he'd picked up to stay calm. Call signs, frequencies, numbers that had to be right. At some point, Vance's voice came through, light, almost bored. "Radio, you still with us?" "Always," Johnson replied. "I can't pretend to know what it felt like to sit there, hands on equipment, trusting a machine, and 10 other men with your life. But I can see how the routine held them together, how habits became a kind of promise when nothing else was certain." The return leg began without ceremony. Darkness pressed against the windows. Johnson adjusted his headset again. He thought about sleep. He thought about breakfast. Then, the aircraft shuddered. The sound was wrong, different, a violent interruption that snapped attention into sharp focus. Johnson heard shouting, not words yet, just noise forced into shape by urgency. Fire bloomed where it shouldn't have been. The smell reached him a second later, acrid and heavy. Latimer's voice cut through. Orders came fast now. Johnson moved without thinking. Training took over. He reached for straps for the chute. His hands shook, just enough that he noticed. "Everybody move," someone yelled. The aircraft lurched again. Heat pressed closer. Johnson's thoughts narrowed to sequence. Do this. Then this. Don't skip anything. He clipped on. He checked the chute. He checked it again. In the confusion, there were fragments of conversation that stuck because they were ordinary. Go, go, go. Watch your step. Johnson reached the exit. The wind was violent, loud, alive. For a split second, he hesitated not from fear, but from the strange urge to make sure everyone else was ready. It was a habit, the same instinct that made him check the radio twice. Then he jumped. The darkness swallowed him. The rush of air stole his breath. Seconds stretched. The chute opened with a force that snapped his body upward, hard enough to hurt. Pain flared in his shoulders. Below him, land, not ocean, shapes he couldn't name. He drifted, spinning slightly, the world reduced to wind and motion. When he hit the ground, it was harder than he expected. He rolled, tasted dirt, lay still until he could breathe again. Somewhere nearby, voices, shouting, not English. Johnson fumbled to gather the chute, hands clumsy now. He thought briefly of the hymn book and hoped it hadn't torn loose. He thought of his mother and the ration tin on the counter. He wondered, absurdly, if peaches grew anywhere near here. Lights appeared. Figures moved. Weapons pointed. Hands grabbed him. Rough. Efficient. He didn't resist. He raised his hands, because that was what came next in the sequence. He was marched. He was searched. His pockets were emptied. The hymn book was taken, flipped through without interest. The photo booth strip fell to the ground and was stepped on before he could say anything. A number was written down somewhere, not his name. Later, how much later, he couldn't tell. He was pushed into a space with others. Irvin Ellingson was there, pale but alive. William Sutherland sat with his back against the wall, jaw clenched. John Welch stared at the floor. Walter Walk coughed, deep and wet. Latimer stood apart, trying to take stock, trying to be the center again. They didn't speak much. When they did, it was in whispers. "You okay?" Johnson asked Walk at one point. Walk nodded, then shook his head. "Just tired," he said. Days blurred. Routines reformed around confinement. Counting footsteps. Sharing scraps of warmth when the night turned cold. Trading small things, buttons, favors, silence. Johnson counted call signs in his head when the guards passed. It helped. On May 1st, Walk didn't wake up. There was no ceremony, no marker, just a body taken away and a space left behind that felt wrong. The men didn't talk about it. They just shifted closer together. Somewhere else, Vance was alive. Somewhere else, systems differed by accident of capture. Johnson didn't know that. He only knew where he was. Back in Houston, language changed. Missing, captured, presumed. Each word arrived like a correction, never like an answer. Johnson's mother flattened the envelopes and placed them in the tin. She waited for breakfast details that never came. I can't pretend to know what Johnson thought in those weeks, or how hope changed shape inside him. I only know that he lived past the jump. He lived past the sky, and that everything that followed would be decided by locked doors, by lists, by choices made by people whose names he never learned. The crash, the fire, the fall, those would be easier to explain later. The harder part was this. He survived the moment everyone expected to kill him, and entered a story where survival no longer meant return. By the time Sergeant Chester A. Johnson, Jr. understood where he was, the system had already closed around him. Movement came first, then paperwork, then quiet. The men were marched through streets that still smelled of smoke and damp ash, past civilians who stared without expression. No one spoke to them. No one explained anything. Johnson walked with Will Latimer, Irvin Ellingson, William Sutherland, John Welch, and Walter Walk, boots scraping stone, hands bound just tightly enough to remind them not to forget. At a junction, they were split. It wasn't announced. There was no shouted order. A few uniforms stepped forward. A hand pointed left. Another pointed right. SSGT. Louis T. Vance was pulled away first. "Hey," Vance said, turning his head as he was guided off. "I'll see you." It wasn't bravado. It was muscle memory, the habit of saying something ordinary when things weren't. Johnson lifted his hand in a half-wave. Yeah, that was the last time he saw him. Later, that separation would become the reason one man lived long enough to testify, and the others did not. But at the time, it felt random. Just another line drawn, without explanation. Johnson's group was taken toward Tokyo. The building they were delivered to did not look like a place where people disappeared. It was ordinary, wooden, low. Surrounded by homes pressed close together, built of materials that caught fire easily. The Tokyo military prison, in the Shibuya district, sat inside a neighborhood that seemed to breathe. Inside, everything slowed. They were stripped of belongings. The search was methodical, impersonal. A guard removed the contents of Johnson's pockets and placed them on a table without interest. The hymn book was flipped through, then set aside. The photo booth strip slid from his hand to the floor and was stepped on before he could react. Names were asked once. They were not used again. A Kempitai sergeant sat behind a desk with a ledger. He wrote steadily, never looking up. When Johnson tried to speak, the sergeant raised one finger. "No," he said, in careful English. Cells were assigned by number. Johnson shared a narrow space with Ellingson and Sutherland. The air smelled of old wood and bodies. The floor was cold, even when the room wasn't. They learned quickly where to sit, where to place their backs, how to conserve energy without talking about it. Interrogations began almost immediately. The questions repeated: units, routes, frequencies. Johnson answered what he could. When he didn't know, he said so. Sometimes that was accepted. Sometimes it wasn't. One guard leaned close during a session, eyes fixed on Johnson's face. "Radio," he said, tapping Johnson's chest lightly. "You hear many things." Johnson swallowed. "I listened," he replied. It was not the whole truth. It felt safer than honesty. Food arrived irregularly: rice, thin soup, sometimes nothing. Johnson counted mouthfuls the way he once counted call signs, letting numbers keep panic occupied. Ellingson tried to make it into a game. "When we get home," Ellingson said one night, voice low, "I'm eating steak every day." Johnson smiled before he could stop himself. "Tell me what you ate." End quote. "Is not about mains." Ellingson frowned. "What?" "Nothing," Johnson said quickly. "Just something my mother says." They slept when they could. The guards controlled the lights, the doors, the noise. When bombing came close, the guards left first. Walter's walk grew worse. His cough deepened, wet and rattling. At night, Johnson could feel the vibration of it through the floorboards. Walk shook with chills even when the air was warm. Latimer tried to intervene. "He needs a doctor," Latimer told a guard, voice steady. The guard shrugged. Later never came. On May 1st, Walk did not wake. Johnson noticed the stillness first, the absence of sound where that cough had been. He touched Walk's arm. It was cool. Latimer knelt beside him, jaw clenched. "Walter," he said quietly. There was no response. When the guards arrived, they pulled Walk's body away without ceremony. No marker, no record given to the men who had lived beside him. The door closed again. That night, the cell felt wrong. The space where Walk had been became something they could not stop noticing. I can't pretend to know what it does to grief when it's denied even a name. I only know it changes shape. It learns to sit still, to wait. Outside the prison walls, Tokyo burned in sections. Inside, time flattened. Rumors moved through the cells in whispers. Transfers, trials, other camps. Names like Omori passed from mouth to mouth without confirmation. Latimer scratched dates behind a beam where guards wouldn't look. "April 14, he said once. "Don't lose that." Johnson nodded. He didn't know why it mattered, but he trusted Latimer's insistence that it did. In Houston, Johnson's mother adjusted without realizing she was doing it. She checked the mailbox twice a day now. She flattened envelopes more carefully. She repeated the latest phrase officials had given her. "Captured." Then later, "presumed." "Where Asuli Akri Saida been." "Where got him in evacment." Each word felt smaller than the one before. She kept the ration tin on the counter. It was getting heavier. Inside the prison, smoke began to seep in more often. The air tasted bitter. Johnson's eyes burned on nights when the bombing came close. Men shouted from other cells. Someone pounded on a door until the sound dulled. One guard stopped outside Johnson's cell one afternoon and looked at him longer than usual. "Radio," he said again, almost thoughtfully. Johnson met his eyes and said nothing. Weeks passed. Survival became mechanical. Count, eat, sit, wait. On the night of May 25th, the air felt wrong. Heavy, expectant. Johnson smelled smoke before he heard the sirens. Then the sound rose distant at first, then unmistakable. Engines. Many of them. Ellingson spoke without thinking. "Those are ours." Latimer stood. "Stay calm," he said. "Listen." The guards were already gone. Heat pressed against the walls. Smoke poured through gaps in the wood. Someone screamed from another cell. "Open it," a voice shouted. "Open the door." The door stayed closed. Johnson covered his mouth with his sleeve, coughing hard now. His eyes streamed. He thought of the hymn book, of how quickly paper burned. He thought of his mother's kitchen, of the tin on the counter, filled with flattened proof that waiting had happened. I can't pretend to know what it felt like to realize that survival had carried him into a place designed to forget him. I only know this. By the time the fire arrived, the story had already shifted. The mystery was no longer the crash. It was what happened after inside a locked system, where living past the jump did not mean coming home. The first thing Dr. Mara Klein noticed was the smell. Not rot, nothing so dramatic. It was drier than that. Chalky. Old. The kind of scent that clung to gloves and followed you home if you forgot to wash your hands long enough. It reminded her of burned paper, the way ash sometimes carried a faint sweetness that didn't belong to it. She stood in a quiet room at Manila American Cemetery, looking at a row of caskets that had not been opened since the late 1940s. Each one was identical. Each one had been labeled with care and then abandoned by certainty. Tokyo Prison Fire. The project file read. The words were clinical. They didn't prepare you for the wait. Mara had been with the Defense POW, MIA accounting agency, long enough to know that reopening old cases always came with resistance, logistical, political, emotional. This one came with a different kind of hesitation. The remains inside these caskets had been declared unidentifiable 70 years earlier. The decision hadn't been lazy. It had been honest, given the tools available at the time. Still, the phrase bothered her. Unidentifiable meant someone had tried and failed. It also meant families had been told to stop waiting. She picked up the mechanical pencil from her pocket and turned it once between her fingers. Her father's pencil. He had used it at drafting tables for decades, sharpening it with a small knife he kept in his desk drawer. She liked the weight of it. It reminded her that precision was something you practiced, not something you felt. The case file listed a closed population, roughly 62 American airmen held at the Tokyo military prison in May of 1945. That detail was the hinge. Closed populations were rare gifts in forensic work. You knew who might be there. You knew how many answers were possible. But the remains recovered in 1946, numbered 65. Mara frowned at that. Numbers like that didn't drift. They meant fragmentation, commingling, error layered over trauma. She opened the first casket. Inside were fragments. Long bones shortened by heat. Dental pieces separated from jaws. Everything labeled carefully. Each tag written by someone who had believed order could still be restored. Mara exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said aloud, to no one. "Let's see who you are." Exhumation began in March of 2022, stretching into April as the work slowed under its own gravity. 39 caskets tied directly to the prison fire were lifted, one by one. Each movement was deliberate. Each lid opened felt like a decision you couldn't undo. A colleague stood beside her, checking a list. "Same story," he said quietly. "Burned. Mixed." Mara nodded. "They always are." They worked in silence, broken only by procedure. Photograph. Measure. Catalog. Separate what could be separated. When duplication appeared, 2 left femurs, 3 fragments of the same tooth type, it became a quiet math problem with human stakes. Back in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor Hickam, the lab lights were bright and unforgiving. Mara liked that. It left less room for projection. She labeled trays with codes that meant nothing to families and everything to scientists. One tray held a fragment of cortical bone, dense and promising. Another held dental enamel warped, but intact enough to hope. At night, she went home and tried to leave the smell at the door. Sometimes she failed. Her daughter sat at the kitchen table one evening, spelling homework spread out under a warm lamp. "What do you do at work?" she asked, pencil tapping against paper. Mara hesitated. "I find names," she said finally. Her daughter looked up. "Like baby names?" Mara smiled, then felt it falter. Not exactly. Later, alone, she stared at the sticky notes lined up on her desk. Case numbers, priorities, deadlines that weren't written anywhere official, but pressed just as hard. Families were aging. DNA donors were dying. Time was doing what time always did. The Manila unknowns had been a formal dead end for decades. The cemetery records were meticulous, but the conclusion at the bottom of the page never changed. Unidentifiable. No further action recommended. Mara changed that line with a pen. The first breakthrough came not from bone, but from paper. A wartime roster, confirmed names, ranks, capture status. Chester A. Johnson Jr., radio operator, age 20. Irvin C. Ellingson, radar observer. Will F. Latimer Jr., pilot. The list felt like a roll call, waiting for a response. She traced dates with her pencil. April 14, bailout. May 26, deaths. 1950, burial. 2022, exhumation. The center still felt hollow. DNA work began slowly. Heat had damaged much of what they needed. Nuclear DNA was scarce, unreliable. But mitochondrial DNA passed through maternal lines, offered a path. It wasn't perfect. It required living relatives willing to participate. Phone calls followed. "Hello," Mara said one afternoon, voice careful. "My name is Dr. Klein. I'm calling from the Defense POW, MIA accounting agency." On the other end, a pause. Then a breath drawn in. "I wondered if I'd ever get this call," a woman said. She was Johnson's niece, though Mara didn't know her name yet. "My mother waited her whole life." Consent forms were mailed, samples returned. Each envelope felt heavier than it should have. In the lab, Mara watched sequences align, then refused to. Partial matches. Probabilities climbing, then stalling. She learned to sit with uncertainty without forcing it. One evening, she stayed late, the building quiet except for the hum of ventilation. She wiped ash-like residue from her gloves and stared at a tray, labeled with a simple code. "This matters," she said softly, as if the fragments could hear her. "I won't rush you." Identification came first for Irvin C. Ellingson. In June of 2025, the confirmation was solid dental concordance, mtDNA alignment, contextual fit. Mara let herself breathe out fully for the first time in days. She called the family the next morning. "We've identified your uncle," she said. On the other end, someone began to cry. Not loudly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might be taken back. A month later, the data for Chester A. Johnson Jr. resolved. The match wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, like many truths, but when the threshold was crossed, it stayed crossed. Mara sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. "I have your name," she said, alone in the lab. The official notification went out on July 9th, 2025. Public release would come later. Families were always told first. That rule mattered. When Mara called Johnson's niece again, the woman listened without interrupting. At the end, she asked one question. "Did he suffer?" Mara chose her words carefully. "We know where he was," she said. "We know he wasn't alone." It wasn't everything. It was what she could give. The project folder didn't close. Names remained unresolved. Latimer, Sutherland, Welch. Each solved case sharpened the edges of the unsolved ones. Mara placed her father's pencil back into her pocket and labeled the next tray. Another fragment. Another chance. "I can't pretend to know what it feels like to be the person who tells a family that waiting is over. I only know that discovery doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as impact. It rearranges what people thought they were living with." At the cemetery in Manila, numbered crosses still stood in quiet rows. Some would soon be replaced. Some would not. Mara looked once more at the file header Tokyo Prison Fire Project and understood the contradiction at its core. These men had not been lost. They had been buried, together, and mislabeled by necessity. The modern work didn't undo the fire. It didn't reopen locked doors. But it did something smaller and heavier. It returned a name to a body. And then, without ceremony, it moved on to the next one. In Mara Klein's world, certainty didn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrived as a stack of trays you could not afford to mix up. The lab at Pearl Harbor Hickam smelled faintly of disinfectant and old dust, the kind that settled into the cuffs of gloves. Under bright lights, the remains from Manila looked less like a case and more like the aftermath of a force that had tried to erase shape itself. Heat had changed everything. Bones shortened, curved, split along lines that didn't follow normal breaks. Teeth, usually stubbornly reliable, were scattered like punctuation pulled out of a sentence. Mara set her father's mechanical pencil on the stainless steel table beside a tray and wrote the day's first code on a label. The pencil clicked softly, an ordinary sound that felt almost rude in a room like this. Her technician, Eli Park, slid a card closer. "This one's from casket 27, he said. Mara didn't look up yet. "Photograph first," she replied. "Then we sort. Tenacoming to free, Tenacoming C, Tenacoming C." Eli lifted a small bone fragment with tweezers and held it under the camera. The screen showed a surface like pale stone. It shouldn't have looked so clean. Fire did that. Sometimes it burned away what made a person seem human and left behind something that could be mistaken for artifact. Mara leaned in. "Cortical," she murmured. "Dense. Promising." The outer layer sometimes protected what the inside couldn't. The work began with a paradox. To return names, they had to first take the remains apart. Commingling was the enemy. A left femur belonged to one person. But if you had two left femurs, you had at least two people, no matter what, the old records insisted. The 1940s teams had faced this in Tokyo's aftermath and done what they could, but their tools were limited. They had chalk, calipers, dental charts that were sometimes incomplete, and the stubborn hope that something like a dog tag would survive. This time, the tools were sharper, but the destruction was worse than any modern case. Mara had started from fresh. She began the day sorting with the same ritual. Duplicates first. She lined up femur fragments on foam pads, then humerus pieces, then jaw sections. She measured, she compared, she set aside what clearly could not belong to the same body. Eli watched the line of fragments grow into a grim geometry. "How do you know when to stop splitting?" he asked quietly. Mara's pencil paused. "When the bones stop contradicting each other," she said. "Or when the DNA does." DNA. The word carried comfort for the public, like a magic key that always fit. In the lab, it was stubborn and uneven. Heat damaged nuclear DNA quickly. Sometimes it left nothing usable. Sometimes it left just enough to tease you into trying again. Mara rotated a small fragment under the light. The surface had a glassy sheen, a sign of extreme heat. She could almost feel the temperature that had done this, even though the fragment was cool in her gloved hand. "I hate this part," Eli admitted. Mara nodded once, eyes still on the tray. "Me too." Then she added, because she had learned that honesty mattered with colleagues. "But I'd hate it more if we didn't try." Across the room, Dr. Lena Ortiz, the dental consultant, had a row of tiny bags laid out like evidence in a quiet courtroom. Inside were dental fragments, molar crowns, a piece of enamel, a broken root. Ortiz held a magnifier to her eye and compared shapes to a photocopy of a wartime dental chart that had been scanned so many times the ink looked tired. "This one," Ortiz said, motioning Mara over. "See the filling? The outline's consistent with a pre-war silver amalgam. If we can match this to a chart, it narrows everything." Mara leaned in, the magnifier catching the lab light. She saw the dull sheen of old metal embedded in enamel. "If that's him," Mara said carefully, "it gets us closer." Ortiz didn't answer with optimism. She answered with caution. "It gets us a door," she said, "not the whole room." The records came next. Mara pulled the mission paperwork for B-29 tail number 4224644 and spread it flat. The paper had been digitized, but she kept printed copies anyway. She liked the physicality of it, proof that men had once existed as ink on a page, not only as data points. One signature on a debrief memo always drew her eye. Maj. Harold Hank Rourke, Operations Officer. His name appeared in the margins, in the required lines, in the clipped language of war administration. Rourke had written nothing emotional, but Mara could read the pressure in the way the forms were filled. Dates underlined. Corrections. The quick shorthand of someone who had to process loss fast enough to keep the next aircraft moving. She tapped the page lightly with her pencil. "Rourke signed this the same day the crew was declared missing," Mara told Eli. Eli peered at the document. "He didn't know they were alive," he said. Mara shook her head. "Not then." She traced the chain of paperwork in her mind. Missing aircrew reports, capture notices, presumptions, the long drift into bureaucratic fog. She didn't say the word she was trying not to use too often. She didn't need it. The evidence already held it. The lab work unfolded like controlled suspense. Anthropology would separate. Dental would narrow. DNA would confirm if it could survive the heat. Mara's team extracted DNA from dense bone, choosing fragments that still held some inner structure. They used protocols designed for degraded samples. Slow, careful, with a tolerance for failure. Some extractions produced nothing but a disappointing blank graph. Others produced a thin line that might, with enough corroboration, become a name. When mitochondrial DNA profiles emerged, they weren't matches in the clean TV sense. They were probabilities measured against living relatives who had offered pieces of themselves to the project. That was where the human side re-entered the lab through envelopes. Johnson's niece, Marilyn Johnson, had mailed her DNA sample with a note tucked inside. It wasn't required. It wasn't asked for. It was simply there, written in steady handwriting. "I grew up with a missing chair at the table." Mara read that line twice and felt something shift under her ribs. Not philosophy, something more practical. The reminder that every fragment on her table had once been someone who was joked with, argued with, waited for. She called Marilyn when the profile work reached a meaningful threshold, still not final, but moving. "I don't want to get ahead of ourselves," Mara said, voice careful. Marilyn exhaled into the phone. "Honey, I've lived my whole life behind," she answered. Then, softer, "Just tell me if we're close." "And die. 2 crossabout rounds." Mara looked at the screen numbers, confidence intervals, the cold math of genetics. She glanced down at the tray, at the small, stubborn bone that had survived what it shouldn't have. "We're close," she said. After she hung up, Mara sat still for a moment, then reached for her coffee. It was gas station coffee she'd picked up out of habit, too hot, slightly bitter, comforting only because it was ordinary. She drank it anyway. The warmth grounded her. The first public name to come back from this project was Irvin C. Ellingson, identified in mid-June of 2025. Mara didn't celebrate with a smile or a raised voice. She printed the confirmation packet and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of paper that meant a family's history would change shape overnight. Then came Johnson. The day the identification for Chester A. Johnson Jr. crossed the required threshold, Mara didn't speak at first. She read the final report line by line, looking for any place doubt could hide. Anthropological consistency, dental compatibility where available, DNA alignment, contextual fit with the closed roster. Eli hovered near the doorway. "Is it?" he began. Mara looked up. Her eyes were tired. "Yes," she said. "It's him." Eli let out a breath he'd been holding. "So what now?" Mara set the paper down gently, as if sudden movements could damage certainty. "Now we do it right," she said. "Notification. Documentation. And we don't rush the rest." Because the rest was the part that hurt in a new way. Every time one man was identified, the remaining files became heavier. Will Latimer Jr. still sat in unresolved public status. So did William Sutherland. So did John Welch. Their names were no longer just missing. They were now names waiting behind the names that had returned. And the lab still had contradictions that refused to settle. Why 65 sets of remains were recovered when the prison held roughly 62 airmen? How much mixing had happened at the burial site? Whether non-aircrew material had been gathered accidentally in the aftermath? How many individuals were represented in the fragments they were still sorting? Mara marked a new sticky note and lined it up beside the others. Latimer, Sutherland, Welch. Her daughter called as Mara was packing up one night. "Did you find people today?" the girl asked. Mara held the phone between shoulder and ear, looking at her hands, gloves removed, skin faintly dry from disinfectant. "I found a name," she said. Her daughter was quiet for a beat. "Does the name go home?" Mara swallowed. "Yes," she replied. "That's the point." And then, where so? In the Rex. She didn't add what she couldn't explain to a child. That sometimes home was a cemetery, a funeral flag, a kitchen table where someone had spent a lifetime practicing how to wait. On the last page of Johnson's confirmation packet, the language was clean and final. Identified, accounted for, returned. But Mara knew what those words did not contain. They didn't contain the weeks between capture and death. They didn't contain the sound of a locked door. They didn't contain the decisions made by people who never wrote their names down. I can't pretend to know what it feels like for a family to hold certainty that arrives 80 years late, but I can see why proof matters anyway, because without it, even grief is forced to argue for permission. Before she turned off the lab lights, Mara walked back to the tray that had started her day. She looked at the fragments one more time, not as a scientist, but as a person trying to keep faith with strangers. "Okay," she said softly, the smallest line of dialogue in an empty room. "Next." And with that, the story tightened its grip. Because identification did not answer the hardest question. It only made the right question impossible to avoid. The case had never been about where the plane fell. It was about how men who survived the fall were erased afterward, and who, in the end, decided that erasure would be sealed behind a locked system and a fire. The night the prison burned did not begin with chaos. It began with procedure. Guards moved first. That was the pattern. When the sirens rose and the distant engines layered themselves into a single, unmistakable sound, keys were lifted, doors were opened, instructions were given to everyone except the Americans. Inside the Tokyo military prison in Shibuya, Japanese prisoners were ushered out in groups. Some were barefoot. Some carried bundles tied with string. The guards spoke quickly, sharply, urgency stripped of explanation. The men were moved toward open space, toward air. The Americans stayed where they were. Sergeant Chester A. Johnson, Jr. felt the change in the air before he understood it. Heat pressed against the walls, not yet painful, but wrong, like standing too close to an engine run-up. Smoke crept through seams in the wood and settled low, catching in the throat. He pulled his sleeve over his mouth and tried to breathe shallowly, the way he'd learned to do when something burned nearby. "Those are ours," Irvin Ellingson said again, softer this time, as if repeating it might make the truth smaller. Johnson nodded without answering. He could hear the planes now, not as individual engines, but as a rolling presence. He counted them without meaning to. Old habits didn't ask permission. Down the corridor, someone began to pound on a door. The sound echoed, sharp at first, then dull, as the wood absorbed the force. "Hey!" a voice shouted. "Hey, open it!" No answer. Captain Will Latimer Jr. stood near the center of the cell, shoulders squared, eyes moving from face to face. He was trying to do what he had always done, hold the shape of the group together. "Stay calm," he said. "We don't rush." The words were steady. They were also a lie, though not an unkind one. Outside, the night was changing faster than calm could keep up. Fire found the prison quickly. The buildings around it were built to go. Wood, paper, tight alleys that funneled heat and fed it back into itself. When the flames reached the outer structures, the temperature inside the cells jumped sharply. Johnson felt it along his forearms first, then his face. Sweat poured down his spine. Smoke thickened. Men coughed. Someone retched. "Latimer," William Sutherland said hoarsely. "We can't stay." Latimer tested the door again. Locked. He struck it with his shoulder once, twice. The impact sent pain through his arm, but changed nothing. "Keys!" someone shouted from another cell. "For God's sake!" The guards were gone. Their boots had retreated earlier, fast and decisive. They had made their choice before the Americans had time to understand there was one to be made. Johnson pressed his back against the wall, trying to find cooler air. His thoughts narrowed, the way they always did when the world demanded focus. Breathe when you can. Don't waste movement. Stay with the group. He thought, briefly and absurdly, of his mother's kitchen, of her humming while folding laundry. The sound so ordinary, it felt permanent. He wondered if she was humming now. The first door to give way did not open cleanly. Wood split, hinges screamed. Men poured into the corridor, coughing, eyes streaming, skin already reddening from the heat. A guard appeared at the far end, silhouetted by firelight. He raised a weapon. "Stop!" he shouted. Someone didn't stop. The crack of the shot cut through everything else, sharp and final. A body fell. Another man screamed a name, first name only, the kind used by friends. Johnson flinched hard enough to hurt his neck. Latimer grabbed his arm. "We stay together," he said, voice fierce now. "Don't scatter." They moved as a unit into the corridor, smoke swirling around their legs. The heat was unbearable here, pressing in from all sides. Wood popped and collapsed overhead. Sparks rained down. Johnson's lungs burned. Every breath felt like it scraped something raw inside him. He pulled his sleeve higher, eyes squeezed nearly shut. "Here," someone yelled. "This way." They turned toward an opening, maybe a door, maybe a break where a wall had failed. Johnson could hear shouting beyond it. Japanese voices now, sharp and urgent. He couldn't tell if they were warnings or orders. A blade flashed. A man went down. Another tried to pull him back and was struck for the effort. The difference between dying in fire and being killed while trying to escape was not academic. It was immediate. It was human. It was the difference between being overwhelmed by heat and being met, deliberately, by force. Johnson stumbled and caught himself against the wall. His fingers brushed something in his pocket that shouldn't have been there. An old habit made him check, and for a second he expected to feel paper. There was nothing. The hymn book was long gone. He heard Latimer shout his name, not his rank, his name. "Chester." Johnson turned toward the sound. Smoke blurred everything, turned faces into shapes. He moved, guided more by trust than sight. They were close to air. He could feel it cooler, moving differently. It was right there. Then, the corridor filled with flame. Johnson dropped to his knees, coughing violently. His vision narrowed to a tunnel of light and shadow. He felt hands on his shoulders, pulling him upright. "Stay with me," someone said. He couldn't tell who. The fire roared, loud enough now to drown out individual voices. Wood collapsed behind them, cutting off the way back. Ahead, the opening shrank as beams fell and flames curled inward. Johnson's thoughts scattered, then regrouped around one concrete fear he'd carried quietly since capture. Dying without anyone knowing where he was. He wanted to say something to Latimer, to Ellingson, to anyone, but his chest wouldn't cooperate. Air came in shallow gasps, each one less useful than the last. I can't pretend to know what it felt like to realize that survival had brought him here, to a place where choice had been stripped away by design. But I can see how the truth of that night doesn't live in maps or mission logs. It lives in doors that were left locked, in guards who evacuated others, and not these men, in moments where someone decided that escape was unacceptable, even as fire erased the building around them. Outside the prison walls, the city burned under American bombs. Inside, American airmen died because they were not released. Later, much later, testimony would describe what happened in fragments. Survivors from nearby cells, Japanese civilians who saw smoke and heard gunfire, guards who claimed confusion, panic, orders they could not quite remember. The record would say fire. It would not always say decision. Johnson's mother would never learn how close he came to air. She would never know whose name he heard last, or whether Latimer managed to keep his voice steady to the end. She would never hear about the locked doors except in language too careful to convey heat. SS Jaint, Louis T. Vance, alive elsewhere, would carry a different weight. He had survived because he was sent to Ofuna, because geography intervened, because a different uniform had taken custody of him. None of it felt earned. Years later, when asked about that night, Vance would say only one thing. The sentence worn thin by repetition. Everybody had time to jump. He did not say what followed. He did not need to. Johnson's story was not a crash story. It was not even a prison story. Not really. It was a story about sequence, about surviving one thing only to be placed deliberately in the path of another. The fire ended by morning. The prison did not exist anymore in any meaningful way. Ash and warped metal marked where cells had been. The dead were gathered quickly, buried together, recorded as a number that did not match the count of men who had entered alive. In the weeks and decades that followed, the emphasis would slide, subtly but decisively. The bombs would be debated. The aircraft would be catalogued. The crash sites would be searched. The locked doors would become a footnote. But this is where the human truth sits, immovable. These men were alive when they were confined, and they died because someone chose not to open a door. Johnson lived long enough to be afraid of something very specific. He lived long enough to hope escape might still be possible. He lived long enough to hear someone call his name. That is not an abstraction. That is a sequence of moments that belonged to a 20-year-old who had once shared peaches with a single spoon and promised his mother he would write. The audience often wants a cleaner ending here. One cause, one blame, one explanation that settles the discomfort. There isn't one. There is only the knowledge that the fire did not act alone, and that the space between captured and never came home was filled with choices that cost men their names for 80 years. The phone call came in the afternoon, when the house was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator cycle on and off. Marilyn Johnson let it ring twice before answering. She had learned, over a lifetime of waiting, not to rush toward news. Rushing made disappointment sharper. "Hello?" she said. On the other end, the voice was formal, careful with every word. "Miss Johnson, this is Dr. Mara Klein, calling from the Defense POW MIA accounting agency." Quote, "One Dan." Marilyn sat down at the kitchen table, without realizing she'd done it. Her hand went flat against the wood, steadying herself. "We have identified your relative," Mara said. "Your uncle, Sergeant Chester A. Johnson, Jr." For a moment, Marilyn heard nothing else. Not the explanation that followed, not the dates, not the assurances that the identification met every scientific standard. All she could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her own breath, coming in too fast. After 80 years, the waiting had ended, not with relief, but with impact. "Oh," Marilyn said finally. It was the smallest word she could find that didn't break apart in her mouth. Mara paused, giving space. She had learned that silence used carefully was sometimes the most respectful thing she could offer. "My mother," Marilyn said, voice unsteady now. "She's gone. She waited her whole life." "I know," Mara replied softly. "I'm sorry she didn't get this call." Marilyn closed her eyes. She pictured her mother standing at the kitchen window, staring at the radio as if it might speak. That image had lived in her head since childhood, replayed so often it felt like a memory of her own. "Can I ask something?" Marilyn said. "Yes." "Did he suffer?" Mara chose the words she had practiced, the ones that stayed grounded in fact. "We know where he was," she said. "We know he wasn't alone." Marilyn nodded, even though Mara couldn't see it. It wasn't the answer she wanted. It was the answer she could carry. After the call ended, Marilyn reached for the plastic sleeve in the drawer beside the table. Inside was Johnson's last letter, the paper thin and yellowed, the creases reinforced with careful tape. She slid it out and smoothed it with her palm, a habit inherited from her mother. She noticed something she hadn't before, a faint smudge near the fold, as if the paper had once been damp, not burned, not torn, just marked by handling. It struck her then that this letter had survived things her uncle had not. Outside, a delivery truck passed, its engine noise briefly filling the street. Life continuing without ceremony. At Punchbowl Cemetery in Honolulu, a small change followed weeks later. A bronze rosette was placed beside Johnson's name on the wall of the missing. It was no larger than a coin. Easy to miss if you didn't know what it meant. But Marilyn knew. She stood there with her husband, fingers tracing the carved letters. Johnson, Chester A. Gr. For decades, the name had meant not here. Now it meant found not alive, not whole, but no longer adrift. He was 20, Marilyn said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Her husband nodded. "That's all it says?" "That's all it needs to say," she replied. The physical return came later, arranged with military precision. A casket arrived in Houston under a wide sky, the sun unforgivingly bright. The honor guard moved with exactness, every step measured. The flag was folded slowly, deliberately, each crease sharp. Marilyn watched from the front row, hands clasped in her lap. The casket did not contain everything. She knew that. No one had pretended otherwise. What it contained was certainty. As the chaplain spoke, Marilyn's mind drifted to a detail she'd learned only recently, one that hadn't been in any report. Her mother had once told her, in passing, that Chester hated being called Junior. Said it made him feel temporary, like he was borrowing space from someone else. The thought landed with quiet force. 80 years later, he was no longer borrowing anything. When the ceremony ended, a young service member approached Marilyn and handed her the folded flag. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he said, voice steady. Marilyn thanked him and held the flag against her chest. The fabric smelled faintly of starch and sun. Back in Hawaii, Mara Klein closed the Johnson file and placed it in the completed stack. The sound it made when it settled was soft, anticlimactic, one folder among many. She allowed herself a moment, just one, to rest her hands on the desk. Her mechanical pencil lay where she'd left it, worn smooth where her father's fingers had once gripped it. Then she opened the next file. Latimer. Will Feth U. Year. Sutherland. William W. Welfay. John W. The work did not end with one name returned. It never did. At home that night, Mara's daughter asked her the same question she always did. "Did you find people today?" Mara considered her answer. "I helped someone come home," she said. Her daughter nodded, satisfied, and went back to her homework. In Houston, Marilyn laid the flag on the old family table and smoothed it carefully, just as her mother had smoothed envelopes. She placed the letter beside it, still in its plastic sleeve. For the first time, the table felt complete, not healed, not fixed, but balanced in a way it never had been before. There were still questions she could not answer. What did Chester eat in those final weeks? Did he hear American planes overhead and recognize the sound? Did he believe, right up to the end, that someone would open the door? Those questions would remain hers to hold. What she had now was smaller and heavier. A name returned to a body, a place to stand and say it out loud. Chester A. Johnson, Jr. The waiting was over. What remained was memory, reshaped but still alive, settling into objects: a folded flag, a fragile letter, a rosette that caught the light just enough to be seen by those who knew where to look. Marilyn turned off the kitchen light and left the table as it was, not out of reverence, but because some arrangements didn't need improvement. They just needed to be left alone. The story doesn't end with fire, or aircraft, or folded flags. It ends at a kitchen table. An old tin sits near the edge, its lid slightly bent from decades of opening and closing. Inside are envelopes emptied, flattened, saved by a woman who never learned how to stop waiting. Nearby, a hymn book rests with initials written inside. The paper soft from hands that once believed it would be carried home again. A letter lies in a plastic sleeve, its creases reinforced, its promise finally answered too late. At her desk, thousands of miles away, Dr. Mara Klein slides another folder into place and pulls the next one forward. Another name, another family, another chance to return something that should never have been taken. Louis Vance, the last living voice from the crew, still repeats the same sentence when asked about that night. Everybody had time to jump. He says it carefully, like a fact that has to be handled gently. It's true and incomplete. I can't pretend to know what it feels like to wait 80 years for a name to come back. But I can see what waiting leaves behind. Habits, objects, spaces, at tables that never quite close. This wasn't a statistic. This was someone's son, someone's uncle, someone who counted call signs to stay calm and promised he'd write. The war didn't just kill men. It took their names and scattered them, then asked generations to earn them back one fragment at a time. Some names are still out there, carved into stone without rosettes, attached to files that haven't been opened yet. The echo lingers not as a question about fire or blame, but as a quieter reckoning. What else is still waiting to be spoken out loud?